I'll tell you what's a high tariff nation is Canada. Canada charges us 250% for our milk product and other product, and a tremendous tariff on lumber and things as such. And yet we don't need their lumber. We have more lumber than they do. We don't need Canada's lumber.
High tariff nation? If you want a real example, look north. Canada hits the U.S. with tariffs as high as 250% on certain dairy categories, plus heavy duties and long-running disputes on things like lumber. And here's the irony. You'll still hear people say, we don't even need their lumber, we have plenty. That sounds tough until the people who actually build America's homes start sounding the alarm. Because right now, major construction firms across the United States are delivering a rare, coordinated warning. The housing market is sliding into a level of instability they've never had to plan around before. Not because Canada declared a dramatic export ban, not because there was some headline-grabbing shutdown, but because the supply of Canadian softwood lumber is tightening in a way that's already bruising the market, and the industry believes the squeeze is about to get a lot worse. Here's the part that makes Washington uncomfortable. Roughly 30 to 35% of the softwood lumber used in U.S. home building comes from Canada. That is not a small nice-to-have. That's a foundational input. And Canada has been reshaping how it prices, processes, and routes that lumber in ways that can dodge the usual trade war playbook while still landing maximum pressure on American construction costs. In a typical wood frame U.S. house, lumber can represent around 20 to 25% of total material costs. When lumber jumps, it doesn't nudge home prices, it shoves them. Industry estimates are blunt. A 10% increase in lumber can tack on roughly $8,000 to $15,000 to the price of a new home. For buyers already getting squeezed by high interest rates and stubborn inflation, that isn't an inconvenience. It's the difference between qualifying and not qualifying, between getting the keys and staying locked out. So the real question isn't, is Canada banning lumber? They aren't. The real question is, if there's no ban, why does it feel like the floor is moving under the U.S. housing market anyway? Is this just another episode in the softwood lumber trade saga, or is it something deeper, a new kind of resource leverage, built not on dramatic announcements, but on structure, on systems that quietly redirect supply, inflate costs, and limit access without ever looking like a restriction on paper? That's the part many policymakers missed until it started showing up in bids, timelines, and final sale prices. Canada isn't winning this through headlines. Canada is winning it through architecture, by changing the rules of the game from the inside out. Start with production control. Canada has been reducing output by closing or consolidating older, less efficient sawmills. Since the 2018 peak, national softwood production has dropped meaningfully, and in key producing regions like British Columbia, job losses in forestry have been massive over recent years. Whether you call it modernization, consolidation, or capacity reset, the effect is the same. Fewer mills means less output means tighter supply, and tighter supply means higher prices. And the premium doesn't land in American pockets, it lands in Canada's. Then there's domestic priority. Provinces and local policy decisions increasingly push lumber toward Canadian housing, infrastructure, and public construction first. Exporting to the U.S. isn't treated as the automatic default it once was. When supply gets tight, American buyers don't get banned, they just get pushed to the back of the line. No dramatic speech required, just a shift in priorities, Canadian resources for Canadian needs at Canadian pricing. And here's where it gets even more strategic: value-added processing. Canada is shipping less raw, basic lumber and more engineered wood products, things like cross-laminated timber, glued laminated beams, and advanced panels. That changes everything. It means less physical volume of the kind of affordable boards U.S. builders rely on, even if the export value looks strong on paper. Canada earns more per tree, keeps more jobs at home, builds more skilled wage growth, and sells products with stronger pricing power, while American builders scramble for the simple, high-volume inputs they need to keep projects moving. Now, layer on environmental standards. Carbon tracking, sustainability certifications, and traceability rules raise compliance costs and reduce frictionless supply. The U.S. can still technically buy the lumber, sure, but it's now more expensive, often slower, and less abundant than before. And that's the point. Environmental policy becomes an indirect trade lever. It can shape costs and access without looking like a traditional trade weapon, while still producing tariff-like pain. Then comes logistics prioritization, the quiet squeeze most people never see. Rail and port capacity gets allocated to what's considered more urgent or higher value: energy shipments, minerals, critical materials. Lumber ends up dealing with delays, uncertainty, and rising transport costs. Again, no ban, just bottlenecks. And bottlenecks are deadly in construction because construction runs on timing as much as it runs on materials. When you put all of this together, you don't get a single obvious restriction you can point to and fight with one legal case or one tariff adjustment. You get a structural choke, multiple pressure points tightening at once. And that's exactly why builders are panicking. You can't fix this with one policy lever. There's no single switch to flip. Now, watch what happens inside the U.S. market when lumber becomes unstable. Builders don't politely absorb the cost. They can't. They price defensively. They add risk premiums not just to cover today's higher material costs, but to protect themselves against next month's volatility. That means home prices rise faster than wages, the affordability crisis deepens, and inflation gets another shot of fuel. And it doesn't stop there. Lumber instability turns into a timeline crisis. Construction is a chain. One delay triggers another. If a project slips by even a month, total costs can jump dramatically due to financing charges, labor retention issues, equipment rental fees, and scheduling domino effects. In a market already strained, delays don't smooth things out, they amplify the damage. Then comes the expectations crisis, where fear becomes its own form of inflation. Developers and wholesalers rush to lock in supply early. Distributors overorder just in case. People hoard. Speculators step in. And suddenly, you get artificial shortages stacked on top of real shortages. Prices rise not only because the lumber is tighter, but because everyone believes it will be tighter tomorrow. That feedback loop destabilizes pricing across the entire housing pipeline. And finally, the part Washington is truly worried about, the political fallout. Housing isn't just an economic story anymore, it's a voter story. Rising home prices shut younger families out of ownership, push rents higher, and keep housing inflation heavy inside the broader inflation numbers people feel every day. And as long as inflation stays stubborn, interest rates stay higher for longer, and the cost spiral keeps feeding itself, one more turn of the screw that traces back to resource dependency and trade policy choices that never got resolved. Here's what a lot of commentary misses. Canada benefits from this restructuring in several ways, even if it looks quiet from the outside. By shifting toward engineered products, Canada captures more value per tree and upgrades the quality of the jobs tied to forestry. Instead of being treated like a low-margin supplier of raw inputs to American demand, Canada sells higher-margin outputs with stronger pricing power. That's a major economic repositioning. By embedding sustainability, certification, and traceability into the supply chain, Canada becomes a rule setter. And in an era where tariffs are blunt, standards are sharp. Standards can shape who gets access at what cost and under what conditions without looking like a traditional trade weapon. Canada also frames forests as strategic assets rather than just inventory. Slower harvesting and tighter capacity can support long-term ecological stability and pricing stability. That strengthens credibility as a reliable supplier, just not an unlimited supplier. And by diversifying buyers, Canada reduces dependence on the U.S. market and therefore reduces vulnerability to U.S. political pressure. If European and Asian buyers are willing to meet Canadian standards and pay Canadian prices, the leverage shifts. So what is Canada really signaling here? First, to Canadians, natural resources won't be sold at discount pricing just to satisfy someone else's demand. The goal becomes fewer exports, better jobs, higher wages, and more value kept at home. Second, to the U.S., Canada is no longer an automatic safety valve for American consumption. Trade is reciprocal, not assumed. Proximity doesn't guarantee priority. And third, to the world, Canada wants the reputation of a stable, rules-based supplier, but on its own terms. Meet the standards, invest properly, and supply is dependable. Ignore the standards, and access tightens. Meanwhile, Washington's standard responses fall into the same familiar traps. Tariffs and legal actions come back, softwood lumber duties, trade cases, and political speeches. But tariffs often just raise prices inside the U.S. without magically creating new supply. The consumer and the builder end up paying for the fight. Pushing domestic production sounds great until you run into environmental permitting timelines, legal challenges, labor constraints,